Welcome to the EXCELcast. I'm Jonathan Kuskiski from the EXCEL Lab here at the University of Michigan, and today I'm speaking with Marly Spieser-Schneider, a movement-based multidisciplinary artist and a BFA alum from 2009. Welcome back, and thank you
so much.
Thank you for spending some time to talk with us as well, Marly.
Absolutely.
Great. So let's just jump back in time for a moment to 2009. You're on the cusp of graduation. And what were your dreams, hopes, and/or plans for after graduation?
Well, I was horrified, to be totally honest. And I think the fears that any artist has, sort of like, am I good enough for what I want to do? And then like, even beyond that, what exactly, do I know what I want to do? There were all those questions. I think more than anything, I had sort of an interesting fear, but I knew people in my life that had sort of gone, whether it was dance or another form, sort of gone to New York or gone somewhere and engaged in the form. But anyone that's in an artistic field knows that you do a lot of, you get the projects you want, but you do a lot of teaching, you do a lot of scrounging, you do a lot of stuff that maybe is less inspiring. And I had this fear that I was gonna learn to hate dance, which is a little bit of a weird thing to say, but there were certain lifestyles that like I really felt this sort of need to continue to love what I had been studying. And there were things about possible paths that made me feel a little nervous about losing that love, which kind of felt like I would lose everything. So I think a big thing on my mind was, how do I continue to engage in this and build a career and do so in a way that feels fulfilling, and doesn't feel like it's taking more than it's giving. Yeah, I mean, there were a lot of emotions, but I think that was really like at the surface of it for me. How do I keep growing my passion and interest in exploring this, as opposed to cut that off?
So it sounds like you had a pretty open mindset in terms of what pathway might lead you to that goal, right?
Yeah,
I
did.
Had the goal, this sort of question at least in mind of what might mean.
I think that there are always the sort of ideas of like, I would love to be in this company, I would love to do this, I would love to go here, and I had some of that, but I think it was really more important to me beyond all else that this form of expression stay a part of my life in a way that was always growing and always feeding me, and not just becoming a job.
I see. Okay, so what did you end up doing? I mean, when push came to shove and you passed the finish line with graduation, what happened next?
Well, the first thing I did was travel for a while around the country, and I had done some traveling while I was in school in Central America, which really, travel has always kind of changed every time I travel, it like really opens me up in a way that I don't find when I'm in a place that is just comfortable and commonplace to me. And I think my travel while I was in school gave me a sense of like independence that I maybe had never felt, because I was in a foreign place, and just like freedom. There's something amazing about realizing that any given day you wake up, like maybe you missed the bus you thought you were going to get on, but no one else is depending on you. This is all you making choices about where you go and how you interact with people and the world. And so I think, I think I've always had some wanderlust, but that experience in school definitely like burst something open that made me realize I needed that. So when I graduated, the first thing I did was, I was home for a little bit over the summer. I'm from Ann Arbor. So I kind of stuck around, and then I hit the road, partially with a friend, partially on my own, and I traveled around the country and stopped in many places, but I made 8 points, sort of pinpointed locations where I engaged with another movement artist, whether that be creating a work. I made some kind of more finished pieces with people, and other times it was just kind of playing in the studio, but I made a point to connect with other movement artists along my path.
Wow, and were these artists that you had learned about through your study here, or how did you pick those people?
Many of them were friends of mine. They actually were not all movement artists. I should clarify that. I had, there were a couple people that were musicians that I met up with, and we kind of played together and collaborated. And then there were a couple people that I met, I guess they were all kind of through the university, but like some professors said, oh, this woman who graduated 6 years before you is in Seattle, and you should connect with her. And so I just kind of went on a limb, and I did, and it was great. So it was all kind of in the U of M family for the most part, but there were different paths to encountering those people.
Interesting. And so where did you end up sort of landing after all of that? I mean, Where did that lead you?
Still landing. So I did come home back to Ann Arbor for a few months, and then I moved to Vermont with some encouragement from a good friend and my professor, Amy Shavash. She had worked there before and connected me with a woman who had taken her position and had a small company in Vermont. And I was sort of kind of on that wavelength of like, do I just go to New York, or is that going to freak me out? Maybe I just didn't have confidence in myself. I don't know. Maybe there was some fear there that I didn't fully recognize, but I couldn't quite decide if I wanted to jump in to that world. And Amy kind of said, go meet these people. And I auditioned for Tiffany Reinert's company, Big Ape. And she was like, if you really want to come out here, we'd love to have you. And so that just is what I decided to do. I was like, why not? You know, there's nothing, you know, that became a really incredible group of people. I stayed in Vermont much longer than I anticipated, and there's a handful of people that I still are some of my closest collaborators. So it was really wonderful. Yeah.
Great. So you landed in Vermont, which I mean probably wasn't part of the original plan by any means. You followed this pathway and the connections and the sort of that search that you mentioned at the beginning for a place and a space where you can really explore your artistry. Can you talk a little bit about, you know, your sort of aesthetic interests and your process in terms of creating work, whether you are the initiator or you're a collaborator with another artist?
Well, I really love collaborating with other people. I'm sort of like every day. I didn't used to be much of a journaler, but now it's like I have so many ideas constantly that I'm always writing down ideas. So like the ideas for projects or, you know, experiments or pieces, you know, whatever, there's all these ideas. But I think for me, the work that I've been the most proud of, or that I have felt the most sort of fulfilled by, was always work that was really closely working with one or more people. And I think part of that is I've always loved in the world of dance, like learning someone else's movement, because I think it's just so incredible that, I mean, this is true for all art, for all creative work, but like that you and I could have gone to the exact same dance school from age 3 and taken the same classes, and we could literally have all the same training. And if I just said, Jonathan, do a Jonathan move, it would be so different from anything I would ever do. And I'm just so fascinated by the kind of kinesthetic knowledge that we carry with us. And so I think part of me always loving collaborating is that there's things that bubble up from another person that they just aren't in me, and vice versa. And I kind of feel like it's sort of it's kind of like learning a language and becoming more and more and more fluent, having all these different interactions with different dialects. And it's learning about yourself, and it's learning about this other person, and it's learning about what movement even is. And so I'm getting a little off track, but I think that's my collaborative work is really important to me. And my personal approach is something that honestly is really, I kind of feel like just now sinking in, because I struggle with the, you know, like when I am on the dance floor listening to Shaka Khan, there is nothing that can stop me, and movement is like the highest truth, and it's all there is, and I have no questions about my path. And then someone says, hey, you want to make a piece? And I go into a studio and I'm like, what do I do? You know, like there's just that block that happens. And so a lot of my work right now is sort of coming up with sort of structural concepts that allow me to get past that sort of freeze that happens. And I'm also a student and teacher of yoga, and I had this teacher that would like all the time talk about that structure was only there to find freedom. And that's a really big, you know, I really rely these days on developing a structure for myself within which to work. And I feel like I'm getting better and better at sort of tapping into that kinesthetic and intuitive knowledge that, you know, comes when it wants to come, and then you can't grab onto it. And I'm just trying to find ways to tap into it in a more regular way, you know, and when I want it and when I need it.
That's great. So, I mean, and you refer to yourself rather than just as a dancer or a choreographer, as a movement-based multidisciplinary artist, which I think probably speaks to your collaborative or open mindset too. So can you talk maybe about a project in particular that might illustrate sort of some of these ideas in action, either a recent one or one from the past? Yeah,
I mean, I think that I'll talk a little bit about, just because it's also associated with this university, I just worked on a video project, the 5-screen, the PUP visualizer, the 5-screen video project. That's maybe a little hard to explain in this circumstance, but the what I want to address about it is that it required me to think in such a different way. And I really love video and I work with it a lot, but I'm like, I took a class, I took classes here, but I'm beyond that, I'm just teaching myself. So in a lot of ways, this project was really, really over my head. But I worked with one of my best friends who's a photographer and video artist, and he did all the filming, and he's not as much in video editing, but he does a lot of camera work. And so his perspective on what made a successful video shot was really interesting, because I was coming at it from the perspective of what woodwork moving within the frame, and so there was that was just a really great conversation, and it made it possible for me. His insight made it possible that when I got down to the editing, which was really hard because I was editing for 5 screens and it became very kind of mathy, which I love, but it was a huge challenge. I think that it gave me a little bit of an edge working on this project that was in a lot of ways kind of above my pay grade, not that I was going to pay, but a little bit above my knowledge as far as video goes. Just hearing him talking about, when he was filming me moving, he was looking at really different things than I was. And it was also interesting because I lack some of the more fancy video knowledge, or was kind of teaching myself it in the process. I looked at the video as if I was choreographing a dance. So that was also interesting, that I approached a medium that I'm less familiar with. And that was kind of my breakthrough. I was like, this is so hard. And then I was like, well, just what would it be if you actually had all these bodies and you were choreographing a dance? And so that was, I think, collaboration between people, but also between mediums. That's, sometimes, I don't know, sometimes I hum a tune and then I make up movement to it, but just that there's different ways in which inspiration kind of filters in, and then how to bring those ideas together. And that project was amazing, but it really, working with someone that was versed in such a different form and then forcing myself to bring my dance knowledge into this other field was it was huge. It was awesome. I learned so much.
That's great. Well, there's definitely, from what we've talked about today, it's really clear how open you are. And you seem to be very curious and looking for new collaborations. Just like you were curious and were on the search to work and connect with all these people when you graduated. I
might be curious to a fault. I mean, honestly, that's the lust for life kind of sends me out in a lot of different directions, but it's also a strength. So,
well, I think I don't think it can be a disadvantage as an artist to be curious. So that's great.
Thanks.
I'm glad. So I'm glad you brought it up, and I wanted to ask you one more question. Which is about sort of how this term career is one that obviously is sort of in our realm here at EXCEL, and it's kind of a problematic or challenging term because I think so many, especially young artists, on the cusp of that decision to embarking on a professional career after school, we think so often in terms of seizing existing opportunities. You mentioned that dream job that we probably all have lurking in the back of our minds. But what we found over and over again in these conversations is that so much of what makes it possible for an artist to build a sustainable life is creating opportunities. And your story really bears that out. So can you talk a little bit about, I don't know what you think about when you hear the word career. Can you talk a little bit about your mindset?
I think, no, I mean, to be totally honest, there have been many times in my life since I've graduated that I've really struggled because in the sort of mainstream idea of how one is successfully an artist, I could sort of define myself as failing multiple times along my path. And like everyone, I have a lot of doubts and I have a lot of questions about my choices. And I think that I still have days where I'm a little bit like, if only I had, maybe I would be in this company and doing this thing. But I also feel at this point in my life, I feel very aware of how much everything I have done has helped me to grow. And I'm sort of constantly creating because I feel like everything is now an influence. And so it's been important to me to sort of, and as an artist, I mean, I think everyone in an artistic field will understand that you're almost always, unless even some really big people that are really successful, you're kind of always supplementing, right? Whether it's just with teaching that or working a totally different job. And I think I've thought about that as being, for a while I had that framed as a negative thing. And now I feel a little bit like, I mean, as an artist, you're sort of constantly like taking an experience and reimagining it and bringing it into a different light, or looking at it from a different angle. So all my experiences are more and more becoming my assets, and I'm more and more open to that and less critical of that. And I have a good friend in Vermont who I collaborate with a lot, Abby Waring. I'll put that out there because she's awesome. She and I have had a lot of conversations about, as opposed to being an artist, we're both interested in living an artful life. So bringing that into everything we do. And right now, like, one of my jobs is working on a farm, but one of the things I'm doing is creating an artistic space there. And like, I feel inspired all the time by being there. And I often come home from that and sort of have some, inspiration to create. And so I think the career thing for me is sort of, maybe my career path is just like being all the things and trying all the things. And I think that, I'm sure as I go on, my focus will shift and maybe things will crystallize in a different way. But I'm kind of, I would say you're catching me at a moment where I'm just sort of settling into the idea that what I'm doing is as valid as anything else, and that a career takes a lot of different forms.
Yeah, that's
it's
great.
Not one thing.
That's great. And I'm so glad you said that, and you framed all these things that you've done as part of an artistic life, and that's so important. We hear this term portfolio career so much today, right? And that may have certain advantages, but there's certainly potentially disadvantages too, right? Because you're much more responsible for building that resiliency, and there are no guarantees. But one of the sort of lessons or things I've been thinking about through all these conversations is how those individuals who can sort of see the spectrum of their activity and understand how one activity can actually support another that might seem very, very different. You mentioned a farm and creative artistic activity, and find ways to, in some ways, elevate or support or create stability in order to pursue those things. It's just it's a through line through all these artistic stories. So,
and if I may, one thing that came up at the end of teaching this workshop today was I was asked what I did over the summers when I was in school. So I was in school studying dance, and I had to work. Like, I had to work over the summers. And I mean, I would do dance things, but it was never easy for me to like take 3 months and go somewhere. And I was always, or at least initially, a little resentful and jealous of people that was easier to do. But now I think about it, and so often I was doing work that was outdoors or physical or engaged in a really different world than the university world allowed me to. And I really think any practice, be it movement or whatever, any practice that you engage in on a regular basis, for me, feels more and more just like the practice of learning to observe better. And so I was engaging my body in all kinds of activities, and I was observing my body, and it fed into my dance. It really did. And at that point in time, I was not aware of that, and I was a little bit like, ugh, I just have to work all summer, and it's going to be hot and whatever. But I now am really grateful for that, because I think that anything that we keep pushing forward, whether it's, music or dance, and it really comes down to just learning to be more and more sensitive and more able to observe what you're doing and your own self and your surroundings and all of that work. I said that to the students. I was like, if you are not able to go away to a 3-month dance camp, you probably feel how I felt. But let me just say, I feel really differently now about that work. I have a really different framework for that, and I'm much more grateful for those experiences than I was at the time. So
that's great. Well, anyway. I wish we could keep talking.
I know.
Marly.
Sorry.
It's been a real pleasure to talk with you and to learn about your journey and your ongoing journey and the work that you're doing. So thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Jonathan.
We'll look forward to following your work in the future.
Absolutely. Thanks.